Humanity is in a race between consciousness and catastrophe,
We are.
and we need to help consciousness prevail. And psychedelics can help us used well.
Hi, everybody. Marianne Williamson here. Welcome to my podcast. There's some new spirit in the air, something new rising, some big changes, and a lot of wonderful people talking about them. Join with me for conversations that matter. Hi, I'm Marianne Williamson, and welcome to my podcast. There is such a sense these days that something has fallen apart. Something has fallen apart which is more basic than you even might think. The idea that the entire way that we are organizing our civilization, something is not working. And we know this to be true. It has to do with COVID. It has to do with wars all over the planet. It has to do with infrastructures falling apart. It has to do with the environment. And it has to do with how much hate, all this rising tide of right-wing authoritarianism, not just internationally, but even here in our own country. And there's a sense that we're always playing whack-a-mole. We'll try to fix this over there. We'll try to fix that over there. But I think there is an increasing sense that something is wrong on some more basic level. Everybody is sensing that. But at the same time, even with the chaos and the fear and the anxiety and the tension that comes along with that, because people are scared. I mean, so many of the places we look to thinking, well, the government will handle it, or business will handle it, or technology will handle it, or economics will handle it. So many of the things that we thought would, handle the problem if this or that problem got too big, clearly cannot necessarily be counted on to handle it. There's a lot of fear that comes with that. There's a lot of anxiety that comes with that. And also, there's a lot of societal despair that comes from that, because in those places where things are not handled, people are going through desperate circumstances that are causing all kinds of terrible upset in their lives, whether it has to do with addiction, whether it has to do with violence, all the very many ways that we personally as well as societally are experiencing breakdown. But at the same time, there's a sense of something being born. There's a sense of one world, sense of one whole way of doing things that's dying, and a sense of something else that is being born. And this is not the first time in human history that that's true. These kinds of phase transitions happen throughout history. And as we've talked about before, the 21st century mindset is different than the 20th century mindset. The 20th century mindset, very mechanistic. The universe is a big machine. And if you want to fix the machine, you just tweak the pieces of the machine, very Newtonian. A British physicist named James Jean said, it turns out that the world is not a big machine, it's one big thought. And so what the 21st century focuses on in a way that the 20th century mindset didn't is the primacy of human consciousness, the power of human consciousness, and the relationship between human consciousness and the world as we experience it. Because before the 21st century, there was mainly this idea that consciousness had no particular impact on what happens out there. Now there's more and more of an understanding that what we think is the level of cause, and what we experience on the outside is the level of effect. And since what you think is the level of cause and what's out there is the level of effect, you can't, in fact, change the world by just tweaking the pieces of the machine. To look at the world and say, I'm going to change the world just by changing things on the outside is like saying you're going to a movie and you don't like what's happening in the movie. So you're going to go up to the screen to try to change the plot, but that's not where it emanates. Everything happening on the screen is projection. And so people are understanding we've got to look at our thoughts. Because, I remember reading a line from Gandhi where he said the problem with the world is that humanity is not in its right mind. And if you just look objectively at what's happening on this planet, we're insane. The United States alone, 7,000 nuclear bombs. That's how many nuclear bombs we have in our arsenal. Why? I mean, you look at so many of the things, you look at the fact that 12,000 children on this planet starve every day, even though there's no dearth of food. You look at the terrible despair and the crisis economically, socially, materially, biologically, in so many ways, and spiritually and morally in this country alone. Something is wrong on such a deep level. And the fact that people feel that they can't look to the places where we've been used to looking for sustenance and to fix it is actually causing a lot of people to look places where maybe they hadn't thought to look before. Now, I was very much a child of my generation. And during the 60s and the 70s, there was a huge countercultural revolution. And it was multifaceted. The music, the sexual revolution, the cultural revolution, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the assassinations of really our leaders at that time, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and then the students at Kent State. It was a profoundly tumultuous time. Part of all that, part of the whole revolution of thinking that was taking place had to do with drug use, particularly psychedelics. Now, I find it a little bit amusing because we're living at a time where psychedelics are back and everything old is new again. And they're talking about psychedelics now like it's something new, which makes people of a certain age go, it is so not new. And even the way they're talking about it and how it brings forth enlightenment, it brings forth experiences that perhaps are not available in other ways. Well, once again, that's not new either. But I think actually that it's a good thing that psychedelics are being investigated, that they're being researched, that they're being looked at in very serious ways for medicinal purpose, for purposes of enlightenment, yes, to treat depression. There's a lot of talk about psychedelics in the treatment of returning veterans from war zones. And a lot of the interest in all of this is coming from the right as well as from the left, which fascinates me. And my guest today is someone who is a very serious researcher on the issue of psychedelics. He's a man named Rick Doblin, and he is the founder of an organization called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. This has to do with cultural change. It has to do with political change. You know, we have 450,000 people in the prison system in the United States today that are nonviolent drug offenders. When I was in college, there were 300,000 people in prison. Today, over 2.3 million, 450,000 of those who are nonviolent drug offenders. It was in 1971 that President Richard Nixon, announced the war on drugs, which has been a huge and abysmal failure. And of course, the war on drugs has been very good for the private prison industry. It has been very good for the defense contractors as well. But it's been an absolute horror and a human tragedy for many people. There's also a racial element there because Black people and white people take drugs at roughly the same rate, but as in every other offense, Black people are given far more severe sentences for the same crime. One of the reasons I'm against the drug war is because people are taking drugs, they're going to take drugs, and I believe that legalization would lead to the kind of standardized use and regulation, safety regulation that is so needed. Oregon has become the first state to legalize the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. The District of Columbia voters elected to decriminalize the use of magic mushrooms and other psychedelic substances in 2020. Denver, Colorado has decriminalized their use. Santa Cruz, California has decriminalized, and Oakland, California has decriminalized use and possession. I think that this is the direction we're going to be taking, and for good reason. And I agree with Rick Doblin. There's a whole lot there, and I look forward to discussing it with him. Make sure you stay around for after my interview. I will be answering questions as usual, and if you yourself have any questions, write to me at marianne@castmedia.com. Let's talk about psychedelics. Rick Doblin. Rick Doblin, thank you so much for being on the podcast with me. I'm grateful to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to educate people about what we're up to.
Yeah, well, you're a man in great demand now because psychedelics has become a hot topic again. Yes. And as the founder and president of MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. You have raised over $100 million, and it's pretty interesting where you've raised that money. You've raised it from very right-wing sources as well as left-wing. One of the daughters of one of the Koch brothers and Rebecca Mercer. Explain, I want to hear the purpose of MAPS, and I want to hear why you think there is such widespread interest from places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it.
Yeah, well, the purpose of MAPS really is a very broad goal, which is mass mental health. So when we think about humanity as a whole, we're on a dangerous course, and we may be destroying the planet. We're in mass extinction. We're motivated as a mass by fears, by irrational thinking, by struggles for survival in ways that don't fully acknowledge the humanity of other people. So the goal is to spiritualize humanity and to also help deal with trauma, to help us see without all the filters of past hurt and pain, and to sort of cleanse that.
I read that you said that you took acid, I think, when you were 18, and you got a spiritual experience you hadn't gotten from your bar mitzvah.
Yeah, well, actually, when I was 17, but yeah, the first time I took acid, it was like, this is what I thought my bar mitzvah should have been.
Right.
I
Well, it
remember
should have
waking
been.
up the morning after my bar mitzvah, and I'm the oldest of four kids. And so I just didn't have any older siblings to tell me the rituals didn't quite work the way they were portrayed to have worked, and maybe have worked in the past. But I had kind of a simplistic idea that there would be some God figure that would come to me, and it would be some kind of transformation, some illumination, some transition to more adulthood, and nothing happened. And so I just stayed in bed and felt empty. And then the next morning, the same thing. And I thought, God must be busy. You know, a lot of people got bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, and so every day I would be waiting and waiting. And then the next Saturday came along, and a whole new crop of people getting bar and bat mitzvah. And I figured I'd just fallen off the list. It's just not happening. It took me a while to realize that the rituals that have been used for rites of passage in other cultures, in my own culture, may have been much more powerful in the past, but somehow in Western culture, it just didn't have that for me. And what
Well, I
happened
think
what happened when I took LSD was just this sort of dissolving of the ego. It was a challenge of courage to be able to let go, to be able to open up. It was that kind of challenge that you think is what people confront in these spiritual crises. And also it gave me these intimations of the sweep of evolution, the connection and interconnections. And it wasn't that easy. It was difficult. It was painful. I had a hard time letting go, but it really touched on energies that I thought were spiritual and that were things that I wish my bar mitzvah had been able to engage.
I'm not at all critical of psychedelics or anything like that. And they were certainly, when I was young, part of my own journey. However, I think that many people, not just in the past, but even in the present, do find as much transformational power in religious circumstances. For instance, my daughter at her bat mitzvah, I think for her, as well as for me, there was a deep transformative experience there. And I think for many of us, it was the use of psychedelics when we were young that actually placed us on a path of a deeper journey into the spiritual opening of enlightenment. Because as you keep saying about psychedelics, the point is the spiritual journey of enlightenment, whether people find it through religion, whether they find it through drugs, or however, the idea is that we're opening to a new perspective on what it means to be human, because obviously what we're doing now is not working. Right.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say for
So,
my mother, my
mhm,
mother got bat mitzvahed with a bunch of her friends when they were 60, because when
mhm,
they were young, girls didn't get bat mitzvahed. And so
right.
for her, it was it was like a spiritual experience, but it was more like a feminist triumph for her and her friends. And I'm glad to hear that for you and your daughter, it really was
Oh, absolutely.
something that
No,
was spiritual.
when the cantor brought her back to me and said, "You brought her here a child. I
Mm,
return her to you a woman."
mm,
It was like, whoa. for her and for me in my relationship to her. I have to say, the idea of becoming a man in the eyes of God, the idea of becoming a woman in the eyes of God. And of course, I think what happens is that if we do not give adolescents a rite of
Hmm.
passage in a meaningful way, they will find one. And that's what I think a lot of that tattooing has to do with, a lot of the
Yeah,
body
yeah,
piercing. I think sexuality is often, and drugs. Drugs was one of the initiatory experiences in our generation. And then, of course, they're coming back. When you and I were growing up, the problem we ran into, of course, was the war on drugs, their illegality. And this is what's so interesting about what's going on now. I was mentioning earlier all of the places that have decriminalized the use. And
hmm,
I'm sure you agree with me. The good thing about decriminalization is that then we can have safety and safety standards, and it will be a much safer road. So tell me about the work of MAPS and what you're doing
yeah.
politically to
Yeah.
make this change happen.
Okay. Well, I would say though that decrim is just a step in the way. We need full legalization,
Right.
and what we're talking about is licensed legalization. So I think that alcohol is regulated too lightly. That you should have a license to do drugs, and if you misbehave, you get punished for your misbehavior. But then it's harder for you to buy alcohol or to buy any other drugs. And eventually, I think we will have these thousands and thousands and thousands of psychedelic clinics where people will go to have their first experience under supervision so that they know what they're getting into, and then they get a license to buy a whole range of psychedelics. So I think there'll be this kind of licensed legalization system that I think will happen around 2035. So what
Okay.
MAPS is doing is to recognize that when you have a whole culture, basically a whole world that has been fed fear-based information about something, in this case, psychedelics and drugs, and the research into the benefits have been suppressed, and it's being portrayed as destroying the civilization, destroying sanity, that there's so much um, resistance to bring them up from the underground that the most important step is medicalization, and that's a way where through science, through medicine, we're able to carve out some areas where we can show benefits exceeding the risks. And for certain populations, then with the scientific studies, we leverage them into large amounts of media, free earned media that we get, because there's a lot of interest in drugs, a lot of interest in new scientific studies. So MAPS is a nonprofit pharmaceutical company trying to develop psychedelics, in particular MDMA, for initially PTSD, um, and also other psychedelics. And we also have a whole approach towards drug policy reform, and we have what's called the psychedelic harm reduction, or we call it the Zendo Project. So actually, President Biden, um, back when he was in the Senate, he was the co-sponsor of a bill called the RAVE Act, which was hilarious. It was called Reducing America's Vulnerability to Ecstasy. And this imposed incredible penalties on ecstasy, but also it criminalized harm reduction. It had a terrible chilling effect, and he realizes now that it was a mistake. But what we are trying to do is build a culture whereby people can have these experiences on their own in this licensed legalization system, but with honest drug education, with harm reduction, with treatment on demand, and with pure drugs. And we have a parallel approach, which is the medicalization, which is for clinical indications, and it would be ideally covered by insurance. And the medicalization comes first to change people's attitudes. And that's where we've now succeeded. And we've seen that with medical marijuana leading to marijuana legalization. So MAPS is really about this vision that I had really when I was 18 about the world being a terribly frightening place in a lot of ways. I was, traumatized by stories secondhand, by stories of the Holocaust, by the Cuban Missile Crisis, by Vietnam. I was in draft resistor. I studied a lot about nonviolent resistance. I was very politically oriented, and I felt that this sense of connection that you can get has these strong political implications. That if you can feel that we're all in one big network, one historical network, how then can you otherize and dehumanize others? It will be much more difficult. And I'd say the same thing through the 60s that we saw was the space effort and to put people on the moon. And the astronauts talked about the same thing, the sort of overview effect, to see back the Earth as one thing, and that spiritualized a lot of the astronauts as well. So what MAPS is about is really trying to embed technologies of spirituality and healing in modern culture above ground rather than underground. And the vehicle that we have been mostly pursuing has been the nonprofit pharma approach.
Well, I have several questions to ask you. First of all, the whole experience of your youth, which was also the same as mine, drugs were very much a part of peace, love, fighting the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
not specifically the civil rights movement, but the consciousness that gave rise to all of that, and the space, an interest in space, et cetera. But let me ask you a couple of questions that I
Yeah.
think would be on people's minds. First of all, you're saying somebody would go, in your idea of the perfect path forward and legalization,
Yeah.
people would go into a clinical setting where they would take a dose, which is low compared to the doses that we took when we were younger, under the supervision of a clinician, right? And they would get a license to take psychedelics. Is that what it is?
Yeah,
Did you
I would
say?
say yes, except for I would say that the doses would probably be similar to what we took when we were younger in this clinical
Okay,
setting. So
good.
they'd be full experiences. Um,
Okay.
the idea is there that we have to be, when we bring these new technologies up from the underground, that we need to do in a very, very careful way, and we need to be very respectful of the fact that psychedelics are extremely powerful tools. And
Right.
we talk about reintegrating them, or mainstreaming psychedelics, integrating them into society. And what a lot of people don't understand is that the foundations of Western culture, which we think began with the Greeks, that they were a very psychedelic culture, that the longest running mystery ceremony in the history of the world was for about 2,000 years, the Eleusinian Mysteries. And everybody who was anybody in Greek society that we think of today, Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle, they all participated in this Eleusinian mystery where they ended up drinking a potion called Kykeon. They had a spiritual experience that taught them the mystery of life and death, and they could be more alive without sort of the fear of death, and they could be more connected. And the Eleusinian mysteries let women and slaves participate as well as men, um, which
How
is
nice of them.
that was very nice.
But
So yeah.
yeah, go on.
Well, just that this idea of how we are able to understand our role in history and our role in what we want to do with our limited time that we're alive, that if we can help spiritualize people to really understand that this life-death transition is natural, that we don't need to fear death, we don't want it too early, or but it's a necessary part of life, and we can do it gracefully, and we can sort of do it in small ways throughout our lives in what we call the death rebirth experience. And that's part of the essence of what psychedelics are about, is this the death of who we think we are and growing into a bigger conception of who we are.
Well, that's what the journey of enlightenment is, whether through drugs or any other way. But let me ask you once again. I want to talk practical matters here. Somebody would take
Okay.
have their experience with a clinician, and they would get a license.
Yes, and so this license then would permit them to purchase, a range of psychedelics. I think we should
Okay.
have the same thing for alcohol and the same thing for marijuana and all these
Okay.
drugs. Is that the other thing I just want to add is that the cultures that have successfully integrated psychedelics, the Native American church with peyote, the ayahuasca churches from South America, they don't have age limits. So where we talked about adolescents having these experiences, I think that what we would have is laws that would permit people 18 or older to access these drugs on their own. But if you're younger than 18, it would be prohibited unless you had the permission of your parents or your guardian. So there would be a
Okay.
parental override to the laws against use by minors, and that you
Okay.
would have an experience under supervision, the same way that we teach people to drive. Then they have to demonstrate that they can drive with an inspector in the car while they show that they know how to handle it, and then they can drive on their own. So we would have
Are
something similar like that.
obviously the worst thing in the world would be if somebody high on a psychedelic got behind the wheel of a car.
Hmm.
Does that concern you? I mean, how?
Oh, for
What
sure.
about that?
There's, I mean,
You don't let
again,
you don't let a friend drive drunk, and you definitely wouldn't let a friend drive high
yeah,
on a
and you
psychedelic.
wouldn't let them fly an airplane or a lot
Right,
of things.
right, right,
But that's where we have to have honest drug education, and we
right,
have to have, and that's where the idea of the license comes in too. If you misbehave, not only do you
right,
get punished for that, but you get your
right,
license taken away for a while. So
right,
if people understand what it is, then they will pick appropriate times and places. But I should also add that no drug policy is going to stop all drug problems. It's
right.
just
But
that
that's true even now.
when we criminalize something and drive it underground, the problems are worse. The drugs are impure. The education gets corrupted to be completely biased. Then we throw people in cages and we have to justify why are we jailing people. So that driving people underground and driving these things, these experiences and these drugs and criminalizing them has never been about reducing drug abuse. It's always been about persecuting minorities from the very first drug laws that were against the Chinese laborers that made the railroads in the US that smoked opium. And then we criminalized opium. Then it was against the blacks who used marijuana. We had the whole prohibition with alcohol, which quickly people realized was fostering crime and a big disaster. And we also then later on had the laws against marijuana expanded from Mexicans and others to hippies, and the psychedelics were against the laws against that were against the counterculture. So it's never been about really reducing drug abuse, and it's tried to eliminate the understanding about the benefits. So from a practical point of view, from an health equity point of view, the taxes on the sale of these drugs for personal use would pay for the clinics for people to go to get their experience in a clinic setting. So it wouldn't be prohibited to people that couldn't afford it. There would be the option for anybody to do it, subsidized by the government. Then if you wanted to buy it later, you'd have to pay for it yourself. But the thought is that these drugs are beneficial throughout the course of the lifespan. They're used tremendously now to help people face death. There's been studies with psilocybin, LSD, MDMA for people with life-threatening illnesses, scared of dying. They're used, as we talked about, adolescents for a spiritual sense, for sort of vision quests, what they want to do with your life, then midlife crises, and MDMA is tremendous for couples therapy, for emotions, for learning how to listen, learning how to be a better partner, a better lover, a better human being. So these drugs we think will have a use throughout the lifespan, and that they can ground and spiritualize people and keep us thinking about the bigger picture, and also about getting out of these ruts that we can get into in our mind. And that's why we see psilocybin, LSD, ketamine being used now for depression. Our minds tend to form habits, and these habits sort of build grooves into your neurochemistry, actually, and the way we route information in our brain. And then we get trapped sometimes in these patterns, and we need to grow out of them. And so that's where I talked about this sort of ego death, these little death rebirth cycles of who we think we are and what we're trapped in, and then we can expand to a bigger sense. So I think that practically we would have a whole system of regulations and education that would be honest and would help people from a young age to recognize that they shouldn't, it wouldn't be like you should do this or you shouldn't do this. It would be empowering people to make their own decisions. And I think what you said earlier, that you don't need psychedelics. You can have spiritual experiences with your bar mitzvah. You can have spiritual experiences meditating. And the psychedelics, I think one of the big mistakes of the 60s was this sort of statement that unless you had the psychedelics and had these particular insights, you weren't, quote, enlightened, and these were the only tools that worked. And I think that's fundamentally wrong, that there are many, many ways to have these experiences. There are human experiences, and there's different catalysts. And just to say, from a spiritual point of view, when the crackdown happened in against the psychedelics in the 60s, a lot of people, Ram Dass, others, turned to meditation and talked about how their psychedelic experiences were a starter, but that they faded, and now we need these tools. And many people said, okay, we'll give up the psychedelics. Ram Dass was famous for saying, once you got the message, hang up the phone, missing the point that there's multiple different messages throughout the course of your life. But what's been happening now is this sort of split between the spiritual community and the psychedelic community is now coming together. And one of the best
for the
things,
boomers, there would never be that split.
yeah.
For our generation, there would never be that split because of the experiences that we had. So I don't.
Well, and also let's talk briefly about the Grateful Dead, just for a second, so that the idea of celebration, of recreation, has a spiritual element to it as well. And so what we've seen also is that these large groups that where many people take psychedelics, they're listening to music, they're celebrating together, that there's a spiritual element to that as well. And so I think we've sort of adopted this idea that a recreational drug is frivolous, it's reckless, it's superficial, it's somehow or other not spiritual. And I think we need to recognize that you can find spirituality in celebration and play.
I think it's deeper than that. I think that our society, coming out of a Calvinist tradition, has a real fear of ecstasy as an emotion, a real fear of joy. And just to be clear here, MDMA is ecstasy.
Yes,
Isn't
although
it,
ecstasy
basically?
isn't always pure, but MDMA was from the middle 70s to, and this is what a lot of people don't know, so I'm really glad to have an opportunity just to share this, but from the middle 70s to the early 80s, after a lot of the psychedelics had been criminalized, MDMA was used therapeutically under the name Adam. And around 500,000 doses were used throughout the United States, mostly under the name Adam. And these were experiences people had with psychiatrists, with psychotherapists, or with their friends indoors. It did not attract the attention of the police. But some of the people that used it in therapy decided that more people should have it, and it should become more widely used, and they could make a whole bunch of money at it. And that's how it became ecstasy. So it was a therapy drug before it was a party drug. And I think what we're trying to do is bring it back to being a therapy drug.
Yeah, because it did have some very deleterious effects as a party drug, and there's been a lot of overuse of it, et cetera. I think when you talked about education, it's really important. You don't do something like this several times a week. You don't, overuse of drugs is a very, very, very dangerous thing. So let me ask you this. I know a lot of your work, and a lot of work that I've heard others doing as well, has had to do with using these drugs to treat depression and PTSD among returning veterans. So tell us about that.
Well, let me get back to the politics, so that, I've often felt that we don't actually do science, we do political science.
Okay.
So to bring psychedelics back from the underground, it was necessary to, first off, have a patient population that general public is sympathetic with, and for which big pharma's drugs are not really working for everybody. For there's a widely perceived need for new treatments. The patients are sympathetic, and the drug is the gentlest of all. So MDMA is the gentlest of all the psychedelic drugs. So I felt that MDMA would be the drug that would come first of all the psychedelics. And now we're in phase 3. So we are the first drug in phase 3, drug-assisted psychotherapy. The others are several years behind us. Ketamine was made into a medicine, but not with psychotherapy, just as a pharmacological treatment, and it's not as effective unless it were with psychotherapy. So the main people that in America we see this is there's kind of a veneration of veterans and of thank you for your service. The other thing that often gets missed is that the most of the people that have PTSD are women who've been sexually abused or raped or domestic violence, and they're sympathetic as well, not quite as much as you could say the veterans. But that's how I chose MDMA for PTSD. The other part of it is that MDMA is ideal for treating PTSD. PTSD is a disorder where the traumas from the past seem like they're never in the past. They're always about to happen or happening. And people live with high states of anxiety. They get easily triggered. You either get hyperactive or emotionally numb to try to cope with it. There's over 1 million veterans right now on disability for PTSD, from war-related PTSD. So it was actually in 1984 that I, for the first time, worked with a woman who had PTSD. And I was learning to be a therapist before I veered off into the politics, and then studied the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics at the Kennedy School at Harvard and got my master's and Ph.D. from there. But MDMA is tremendous for helping people deal with frightening, fearful emotions. It's a drug that stimulates oxytocin, which is nursing mothers. It's the hormone of love and connection, and it helps people to accept themselves. You feel peaceful and accept where you are and who you are. It's great for eating disorders. It's great for anything where people are sort of at odds with themselves, or that the memories or different things are so painful. So MDMA helps people to process painful memories, meaning to grieve or to cry or to let it out. And one of the people that we work with, Bessel van der Kolk, is a psychiatrist. He's an expert in PTSD. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah,
Which is
powerful book.
And so Bessel is the principal investigator of our Boston site. And so I mentioned that to just say that traumas are stored in the body a lot of times. And so the therapy is about the body release and the emotional release. Also, we work with a woman, Rachel Yehuda, who is a therapist at the Bronx VA and also at Mount Sinai. But she has done studies on the epigenetics of trauma. She's done studies with Holocaust survivors and their children and has identified a biological mechanism by which trauma can be passed from generation to generation. And so starting in 1990, we started trying to work with the VA to try to say to them that this drug could be helpful for Vietnam vets. It's something that seems to work better than other things for PTSD, but it's taken us now 31 years, and we're very close to starting research with Rachel at the Bronx VA and also at the Loma Linda VA. And we're working on a study that would be group therapy at the Portland VA. So it's taken an enormously long time to sort of bring this tool of healing, which we knew was working from experiences and therapy experiences, to bring it to this point where the VA is willing to look at it more. We've had about 40 vets, US vets, in our studies. We've done studies in Israel where everybody is a veteran there or lives under threat of missiles. We haven't had an active duty soldier yet. And we're moving towards that. And I think it's because of this work with vets. You asked about how do we get bipartisan support. And so in the prior Congress, there was a bill to ease the research requirements for psychedelics. And we had two co-sponsors. The bill didn't go anywhere, but we had two co-sponsors. One was AOC, the other was Matt Gaetz.
Yeah, I remember reading that. It was really mind-blowing to me, actually.
Yeah. And so there's just been this willingness on the people to get together about psychedelics and the healing of veterans. Right now we're working with Dan Crenshaw, who's actually a Navy SEAL, and Tim Ryan are going to co-sponsor a bill to try to get money to the DoD and the VA to support MDMA research.
Now, you were talking earlier about the spiritual community, and a lot of the spiritual community has gotten very involved with ayahuasca.
Yes.
So when you talk about MDMA, which is more like ecstasy, then there's ayahuasca, mushroom, psilocybin, LSD. You want to talk to us at all about what the differences as you see them?
Yeah. There's the classic psychedelics like ayahuasca or like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ibogaine, and then I'd say MDMA, MDA are act differently. So the classic psychedelics are about dissolving your sense of self to see a bigger universe. A good way to describe it is sort of like the Galileo, the Copernican revolution. And why that's good also is that people were burned at the stake and were house arrest for the things that they saw through the telescope. And we've had a similar kind of repression for things people have experienced through psychedelics. But to use this kind of metaphor, that this idea of MDMA, they make you so centered in yourself, so grounded in self-acceptance, that you can see the larger universe in a way. Um, the classic psychedelics kind of dissolve the sense of self, so you kind of merge with the sun and the universe in that way, the bigger sense. So that's why it can be frightening for people, because you have to find a new orientation. Your egocentric orientation, which is necessary, is limiting as well. And I think the concept of ego death, the death rebirth, is really misleading in certain ways. We need our ego. We are at the same time part of this eternal process that's going on billions of years in evolution, that we're part of that. We're like, the metaphor is you're a drop of water in the ocean, and your individual drop, and then you're part of the ocean again. And your individual drop is your life. We're part of the universe, but we're also an individual at the same time. And so we need our ego to guide us. But Stan Grof, who's my mentor, Stanislav Grof, is a psychiatrist, the help founded transpersonal psychology, the world's leading LSD researcher. He talked about becoming transparent to the transcendent. And I think both MDMA and the classic psychedelics can help you become transparent to the transcendent. You can see that, it's like, you could say the window becomes transparent. The window doesn't go away. The window is ourself, our ego, our limited life. So you can be part of that and part of the larger thing simultaneously. And I think what's so important, and why this is, I think, going to be so important politically, these experiences, is that you can both appreciate who you are uniquely and who other people are. You can understand our commonality and appreciate the uniqueness and the differences. It's not one or the other. It's not that you lose all sense of individuality and you become part of this, historic, the ocean. That while we're alive, we are both. We're both the ocean and the drop, and that you can both appreciate the commonality and not be scared of differences, appreciate the differences. So I think the classic psychedelics are really good for, we could say that there's a membrane between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And we all know that from our dreams at night. We all have this kind of emergence of a different kind of emotional processing, a different kind of logic, and that things emerge that we might have not thought about during the day, but at night they come to us, that there's the membrane between the conscious and the unconscious. And what Stan Grof has talked about LSD is a non-specific amplifier of the unconscious. So psychedelics, when you take them, you cannot predict what kind of an experience you're going to have, or you can't really predict for sure what's going to come up. Even when we use MDMA for trauma, we can't say, okay, people are going to immediately talk about their trauma. They can have a range of experiences. Sometimes they talk about beautiful experiences that give them strength and connection. Then they look at their trauma. So I think when we talk about psychedelics, people have to understand that it's a switch from linear logic to an emotional logic, and a switch from things emerging in the ways that we normally think to bodily sensations that grow larger. So classic medicines from pharma suppress symptoms, and that's about all that they do. And the approach with psychedelics is to bring the symptoms forward and to enlarge them and let them go. And Stan has also said something he's about to turn 90, by the way, just say, but he said something that's beautiful, which is that the full expression of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. Meaning that everything's in motion, the universe is in motion, you burn through it. And so that if you are feeling like I'm going to be trapped in this forever, and I'm going to be like a hell state, I'm trapped in here forever, and if you open to it and let yourself feel that fully, that sense of being trapped, paradoxically, that's what will free you. That we have to be fully open to all the different emotions. And the same we know from grief. If you open to grief, eventually you can move on. And you don't like leave it behind it because it's part of you. It never goes away, but things shift from the foreground to the background. And
Right.
that's what I think
Right.
what we see with uh, healing people from post-traumatic stress disorder, that
Right.
the trauma doesn't go away. It's not like, oh, this is, several people have said in our studies, I don't know why they call this ecstasy, because it's not fun, it's therapy, it's painful, but there are moments where there's laughter, there's moments of joy, there's moments of acceptance, but you are kind of helping to take these experiences that have never been fully metabolized, and you're making them part of who you are, and then they move from foreground to background, and then you can be more alive going forward.
Well, many of these things, of course, are plants. And like you said, they are ancient
Yeah.
medicines and they are ancient rituals. And it's only in this little aberrational chapter of history and Western civilization that we come up with these ideas surrounding these things that make them appear fearful. And there's a lot of propaganda and for reasons that you've mentioned. But I
Yeah.
also, as someone who has has enough experience to understand, also recognize that what Ram Dass was saying is true too. There's a level on which once you've gotten the call, you can hang up, because even though definitely for me, Rick,
Yeah.
definitely the
Mhm.
experience of psychedelics when I was young definitely put me on a path that I think
Mhm.
made me, for instance, understand something like the A Course in Miracles so much more.
Yes,
You
yes.
know, when the Course in Miracles says this isn't even real, this is just this three-dimensional hallucination, actually uses the word hallucination that you're having, and that beyond that is the mind of God. I was like, yeah, I get it, I get it. So I do think that it's important. I'm glad that it's come back around again as a
Oh,
serious conversation. And I think it's so good that it's being introduced in a way where people will be safe, people will be careful, because it's not something to do casually or take lightly in
oh,
any way,
that's
shape, or
for sure.
form.
Yeah, and in fact, Leo Zeff, who we call the secret chief, he was the person that really, he was the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. He was the one that really, from the middle '70s to the early '80s, introduced MDMA. He also um, shared the Course in Miracles with people a
Mm-hmm.
lot. Um,
Yeah.
but that there's this sense that if we could create a legal experience for you to have a major psychedelic experience again, my guess would be that you would find a lot of value in it. And the reason I say that is that there have been
Well, you're making some assumptions that are interesting, but I hear you.
oh,
So go on.
okay, well,
Yeah.
yeah, you can call me out on my assumptions. I don't
No, I don't want to
mean that.
publicly, but we can
Okay,
go on.
okay, okay, okay. But what I want to share is that there has been an incredible study that was done recently with lifelong Zen meditators who, at an early age, you know, many of them had done psychedelics, got into Zen, given up psychedelics for 40 years or more. So this was a group of very senior Zen meditators who agreed to do a study at a meditation retreat center in Lucerne, Switzerland. Before the meditation retreat, they went to the University of Zurich for brain scans. Then they went to a 5-day retreat. In the middle of it, they all got a pill, and it was either psilocybin or a placebo. And
Okay.
then they took it in a meditation practice in a meditation moment for the day of
Uh-huh.
meditation. Then at the end of this meditation retreat, they went back to the University of Zurich for more brain scans, and then they had long-term follow-ups. And then they did it again where they were switched for those people that got the placebo could get the psilocybin again this time. And what they reported is that they felt that that one experience kind of deepened their was it brought them to places that they had not anticipated. You think the essence of meditation is you're open to anything, you're non-attached, but these patterns of our mind and are so strong that the psychedelics, by shaking up the snow globe, you could say it, in a way that even for these lifelong Zen meditators, new things emerged, new experiences that they were able to sort of grasp onto. And then over time, they were able to deepen their meditation practice.
Yeah.
So, and they showed brain scan changes as well.
And what about, before, I want to ask you about how you see this used. I know you've talked about it for use people in the Middle East, etc., Israelis and
Yes.
Palestinians. But
Yeah.
before I go there, when we were younger, we did know people who clearly had taken too much
Oh,
acid, had
yeah.
taken too
Yeah.
many psychedelics, and fried their brains. So, do you want to say anything about that? Because I just want to be
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
careful that we're
I
careful
think,
here.
yes, I think it's very important that I think the way to think about psychedelics is the same way to think about a knife. They're
Yeah.
tools. They're not inherently beneficial or inherently harmful. The problem with the war on drugs has been that we've invested qualities in things and we have lost the fact that it's the relationship we have with the thing that really is what matters the most. So, yeah, I'd like to help people really understand that the way I view it, the way we view it is they're not take a psychedelic, get enlightened, everything's going to be good. That there are people that take it in reckless ways, or mix it
Right.
with other drugs,
And it's
or
not
take it
something
too
to be
frequently.
reckless with.
No, and the essence of therapy is that it's not about the experience so much; it's about what you bring back. It's the integration. It's the preparation and the integration, so that you have an opportunity. The psychedelics give you an opportunity to open up, but you need to then be prepared for the challenges of opening up like that, because you see things that, I mean, Jung talked about our shadow. So a lot of what we are talking about is you see your shadow. You also see beautiful things that you didn't notice before. But then it's how do you integrate it and how do you make it so that you don't need the drug? So the way in which this is different from pharma is that pharma gives you a drug to control the symptoms. You take it, you're supposed to take it every day. It does have side effects, and you're supposed to take it months, weeks, years, sometimes
They're big on
decades.
telling you expect to be on these for the rest of your life.
With
That's how they make their
psychedelics,
multi-billion
yeah,
dollar
with
empire.
psychedelics, we're saying that combined with therapy, you can have just a few experiences in a series, and it can drastically and fundamentally change your orientation in positive ways if you're prepared and supported, or it could spin you out. And I think a lot of those people that we saw that did it too much, or that were used them and disintegrated rather than became more
Right,
integrated, that
right.
they were not taking it in supportive environments, and they were focusing more on what's the experience that they have while they're on the drug rather than what do they bring back from it.
And
So
they
yeah,
simply
I'd
did too
like to say
much.
it's possible to do too frequently. A lot of
Yeah,
times what we see too is that people run away from the integration to do
right,
more drugs, so that in a
right.
way psychedelic drug use can become an escape from
The
doing the
very
work
thing
that
it's
you
there.
need
Yeah,
to integrate it. So
yeah,
what's Paracelsus said, the difference between a medicine and a poison is dose.
yeah. Oh, wow.
It's
That's
how.
exactly right, too. Look at some OxyContin. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
let's talk about the Middle East. Let's talk
Hmm.
about your
Yeah,
plans with Israelis and Palestinians. So tell me, what do you see? Because obviously it's a very serious subject. The
yeah.
possibility that drugs like this could be used in deep reconciliation of traumas that are mutual and that go back generations.
Yeah, well, you'll appreciate this, but we feel that if we can work with Israelis and Palestinians, eventually we'll be able to work with Republicans and Democrats. The more difficult
Okay.
case. We'll start with the
I want to say
Israelis and
something too.
Palestinians.
If I may, I want to give you a quote from
Sure.
the Course in Miracles that I think you'll
Yeah.
appreciate. It says, "The holiest spot on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love."
Mm.
So when you were talking earlier about how we heal psychologically,
Beautiful.
emotionally, spiritually through a kind of detox, the darkness has got to come up.
Hmm.
The hatred of our separation from one another has to come up in order to be healed. So, yes, please talk to us about
Yeah.
what role you feel this could play.
Well, I've been, my great great grandmother moved to Palestine in 1904. And
Mm-hmm.
she did that in order to die and be buried on the Mount of Olives. So when the Messiah
Mm-hmm.
comes, she'll be the first to rise, and she was buried
Right,
there in 1907. So I have
right.
a long history with Israel, and I was raised to try to make a contribution. Um, and I have found the way to do that, which is to try to bring psychedelic therapy and medical and legalized marijuana to Israel, And so what we found is that on their own, small groups of Israelis and Palestinians were doing ayahuasca and MDMA. They would start with MDMA, usually in individual sessions to get them sort of through a lot of their fears, and then they would be in group sessions either with MDMA or with ayahuasca. And so what we thought we could do, now these are not like the hardcore haters on either side. Again, things start with people that are more open, that are closer, that are willing to build bridges. And what we've decided to try to do is a 3-year study with these Israelis and Palestinians. And the first year, we're now about a year and a half. The first year was interviewing them about why they're doing it, what they see from it, what benefits they see. It's difficult because it's illegal. Ayahuasca is illegal, MDMA is illegal, but there are underground MDMA therapists in Palestine, in the West Bank. There's ayahuasca even in the West Bank, and there's underground LSD, MDMA, marijuana, ayahuasca, all of that in Israel as well. So what we found is that people end up initially working through their own traumas, because you see the other, through this filter of the past traumas. Once you can work through that, then you can start to see your commonalities. So that's why the MDMA was the initial experience that many of these people had to sort of come to grips with their own traumas, and then they could be in these mixed spaces. And one of the stories that came from the interviews was so beautiful. It was about an Israeli who was talking about how in this group session with ayahuasca, and a big part of the ayahuasca is singing, is people singing their prayers. And it's certain churches do it only in Portuguese, but here in Israel, they played Arabic music, and there were prayers in Arabic. And under the influence of ayahuasca, this Israeli said that he had previously cringed whenever he heard Arabic songs or the Arabic language. But under the influence of ayahuasca, he could see the beauty of it, and he could see where they were trying to come from. I'll just say personally, I've been in the Dome of the Rock on the top when they would let non-Muslims in. And,
before
you know,
Sharon
I was
did
thinking,
his thing.
could I pray here? This is where the Jewish temple was. Now it's a Muslim holy spot. But I thought, yeah, I can. And I actually had one experience in this on the top of Mount Sinai. My wife and I had just gotten married in Israel. We went to Mount Sinai. A friend of ours was a Jewish guy from the Kennedy School. And he had a girlfriend from Kuwait who was Muslim. And so we all climbed Mount Sinai, and the four of us with our other parents or others down a little below us, 40, 50 feet below us, we did MDMA on the top of Mount Sinai. And at one point, we just felt the love for all four of us, for each other, for what was going on. And then we realized that every single religion that we represented was going to be furious at what we were doing. Because here it was, I was marrying a non-Jewish woman. She's agreed to raise Jewish kids, which was really important to me. And in the Reformed tradition, you could do it. But in Judaism, it's the religion of the mother. And here it is now. Now, it didn't used to be that way. In the Bible, it was the religion of the father. And they changed that because around the year 1000, because Jews were dispersed and rape was a weapon of war. And you'd have all these
Well, it
babies that
wasn't
were
just
born.
that. It was to know whose baby it really was. I mean, come on, let's be
Well,
real.
but that was for 1,000 years. It was the father. So they have the
It was a
same
question
problem.
even 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, but
All right, so
okay,
go on.
but then in the Muslim religion, it's the religion of the father. And here it was, this Jewish guy was with this Muslim woman. And so we just thought, religion should be about love. Here it is, we're feeling love on the top of Mount Sinai. But when you sort of come down, the religions are all fighting each other. So the Israelis and Palestinians are finding their common ground. And it doesn't mean that they don't have their political struggles, that they don't have their differences, but they can at least get past the dehumanization and the fear and see people as humans struggling in similar ways. And so the next step is going to be to take a group of Israelis and Palestinians to Spain for an ayahuasca ceremony together with a bunch of scientific measures about how they see the other, about hopes for peace, things like that. So it's a very small scale. It's a small seed, but from a small seed, a mighty oak can grow. And so we're hoping that this kind of work can be a different kind of political reconciliation.
I'd like to say something about that because I have been there 5 times. And you're right. There are people, Palestinians and Israelis, who are doing the deeper work and are trying to do the
Yeah.
deeper work. But basically, what you have with Palestinians and Israelis, as you know, is two peoples whose psyches are stuck in an experience of abuse. The Israeli psyche is stuck in the experience of abuse by the Nazis. The Palestinians are the experience of abuse by the Israelis.
Yeah.
And it has been very clear to me for a very long time, this problem, some of the smartest people in the world have tried to fix this particular problem. It's not going to be fixed on the level of the Green Line. It's not going to be fixed
Right.
on the level of what's annexed, what's not. It's going to be on some deeper level. And when you are in Israel, as you said, one of the things I felt when I first went to Israel, you hear the term the Holy Land, and then you're there and you realize this is not just a phrase. Like you said, it's the Dome of the Rock, it's the Western Wall, it's the Church of the Sepulchre. All the great religions of the world are there on this little piece of land. And it is this, and of course, it's the place where some of this greatest hatred is erupting as well. There's such a healing for humanity. And I think that's amazing. I have been in rooms with Palestinians and Israelis doing deep, deep work. You're right, they're there. And you're also very correct that the institutions, whether it has to do with religious institutions, political institutions, so many of the institutional pillars, particularly that have taken us to where we are today, which is on a trajectory of self-destruction for the human race, would not wish to see any of this. It is deeply revolutionary.
Yeah. And I would say that the key challenge I see going forward with the psychedelic renaissance and also with survival of humanity is that we have to really help fundamentalists of all the different religions move to a more mystical orientation. And I think that is our challenge. And psychedelics can help that, to see that these are what people take literally are metaphors and are symbols. And when you concretize them and to make them literal, and then you are fearful if people are infidels or they don't believe it. So I think back to America now, where we got the Christian fundamentalists, how as a major force, how do we help them see that there's a deeper spirituality, that they can have a richer life by surrendering some, and it's not just Christian fundamentalists, it's Orthodox Jews who are crazy in their own way too. And Orthodox Muslims, everything.
Two of your major funders, a daughter of a Koch brother and Rebecca Mercer. First of all, it's shocking to me, but
let me say one thing about Stephen. I was with Stephen Breyer one time at a Passover Seder. And
Stephen Breyer, as in Supreme Court Justice?
Yeah. So people of all the things that I've done for MAPS, the thing that has gotten me the most criticism is accepting $1 million donation from Rebecca Mercer.
Yeah, well.
And so I asked Stephen, I said, I'd like to ask you an ethical question. And we talked about this donation from Rebecca Mercer. And did I do the right thing or the wrong thing? She owned Cambridge Analytica, where their father. They were Breitbart, now Parler. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what he said was inspiring to me, which was, he said, the essence of democracy is finding common ground with people with whom you may disagree with on every other issue. But it's that effort to find common ground. And so he felt that this common ground with Rebecca Mercer, the only limitation on her donation was that it only be used for veterans. And for Elizabeth Koch, she said, I am not my father. And interestingly enough, her father, one of her father's heroes has been Abraham Maslow. And when you talk about humanistic psychology and self-actualization, that there's this, that's
mind-boggling right there.
Yeah, but what we've been, so that's like the you could say that that's the libertarian view, that self-actualization, but what he didn't know, what we've tried to share with him is that, and this is where Stan Grof comes in with transpersonal psychology. Abraham Maslow, in the last few years of his life, started transpersonal psychology as he encountered experiences with psychedelics of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so he revised his hierarchy of needs that a lot of people learn about in high school and college, about your survival needs, your belonging needs, and then you move up to this self-actualization, becoming your full self. But the transition was now, the highest is now self-transcendence. It's going beyond yourself to serve others, to be part of this wave of humanity. And so that's where I
Well,
think we need to make this transition.
yeah, from the idea of a self with a small s to a self with a big S.
Yeah.
The way the Course in Miracles says it is if you think that you're a wave in the ocean, separate from every other wave, then how could you not feel terrified that at any moment you're going to be annihilated by some other wave? But in fact, there's no place where one wave stops and another wave starts. So to be a wave means you are the ocean. And to identify with the whole of the human race and the whole of the universe as opposed to the separate self is the journey of enlightenment. And I agree with you. What we've been doing so far is clearly not working. One of the things I did read in one of the interviews with you has to do with past life experiences on psychedelics.
Yeah.
And you told
Mhm.
an amazing story about the Holocaust and something that you experienced on a psychedelic. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah. Um, now, actually, that was a dream,
Oh, okay.
and so I feel like when we talk about past life experiences, I'll just say that I think that there is this collective unconscious. There is this Jungian collective unconscious, and I think that we can tune in to get information from lives in the past, and we can actually get some accurate information from it. But I don't think it's our life, in the sense that I don't believe in the traditional story of reincarnation, that there's a soul that goes from life to life to life. I don't believe that at all. I believe that there's this collective history, and we have this emotional resonance to situations that are similar to our own right now. And then you can tune into a past life, and I believe that it's like the holographic theory of reality, that there's a little bit less definition, but you can get to it. And so I just think that it's a bit egotistical to think about it as my life. I
Yeah.
think that when we're gone, we're into the ocean. So I don't believe that. But this dream was, I'd say, the most important dream of my entire life, and it was a dream of. Did you remember 2001: Space Odyssey?
Sure.
Okay, so the in the end of that movie, there's the astronaut. He's in an all white room. He's on his deathbed. It's before the birth of the star child.
Right.
So the dream is there's a person on his deathbed. This was a dream in my 20s. He's on his deathbed, and I'm there, and this person that's on his deathbed says, I was saved at an earlier point of my life, miraculously. I should have died, but I was saved. And I was saved, and I felt that I was saved for a purpose, but I never knew what the purpose was. And he said, let me show you what happened. And so we sort of were transported back to World War II. And he was part of a group of a large number of Jews that were taken out from their village to the outskirts of town. They had to dig their own graves, and they were all machine gunned and killed and put in the graves. And then I saw this happen, and then it became a little bit like the Jesus story, where he was buried for 3 days. He wasn't killed. He was sort of wounded and stunned, but then he woke up and was sort of resurrected and climbed through bodies to the surface, and nobody was there. It was at the edge of town. He ran into the woods, and he was found by the partisans, and he was able to survive the war. And so once I saw this in excruciating detail, then we're snapped back, we're in the room. And then he's on his deathbed, and he says, now I know what my purpose is, why I was saved then. And I was like, oh, why? He said, it's to tell you to become a psychedelic therapist and to study psychedelics and bring back psychedelics. And
I tell you,
in my head, I thought, I've already decided to do this so that I can say yes, and you can die in peace. And then he died in peace. And I've taken that on. We're trying to empower people to confront things that are painful. They have to be willing to do that. And if they're not willing, they're not going to get better. And so there are some people. So for example, Trump. So okay, Marianne, this is so good. So I had an experience under the influence of ketamine watching Hitler give a speech and the Nuremberg rallies. And it was, I was there, but I was not there. It was terrifying. But I got this whole sense of the power dynamic between the many and the one, the many giving their power to the one, and the Heil Hitler salute back and forth. And I thought, how do I get into his head and Hitler's head? And how do we heal? How do we heal Nixon? How do we heal Trump? How do we heal these people so they don't do these things? And what I realized during this experience has led to my political and strategic approach to psychedelics, which is that unless they're willing, you cannot do it. But the people that give away their power are getting less from it. So ironically, what we need to do is not to give psychedelics to Trump or to Nixon, and then they'll have this miraculous transformation. But it's both harder and easier. We need to spiritualize hundreds of millions of people to get them to own their own power so they don't give away their power like that. And I think that's where the spiritualization of humanity comes in. And that's where drug policy reform, as well as nonprofit psychedelic drug development, comes in. We have to anchor the spirituality in humanity as a whole. There will always be crazy people who will choose selfishness.
Absolutely. And I, for the last 37 years, that has been my career. Spirituality and speaking and writing. And you're absolutely correct. Hitler could not have done what he did without enough people in Germany and elsewhere who, although they would not have come up with those evil ideas themselves, did not have the moral fiber to say no to him when he did. And that has been the goal, the idea of creating a society, not where we could guarantee that a Hitler would not arise, but where not enough people would agree with him for him to be able to do any collective malfeasance of real import. That is what makes this moment so frightening. That is what makes this moment so scary. Not just Donald Trump, but how many people are willing to give their power over to him. There was a man today, it was on the internet that I saw, a gentleman in North Carolina, which had censured the North Carolinian senator, a Republican senator, for voting for conviction during the second impeachment trial. And this man from the Republican Party in North Carolina was saying, we didn't send him there to act on his conscience. We didn't send him there to do whatever he thinks is the right thing. We sent him there to do whatever Donald Trump wanted. When you start hearing things like that over and over, you have a problem on your hands. And we have a problem on our hands. And I think answers are coming from many different places.
Yeah, and I think for me, another one of my psychedelic experiences was acknowledging that there was, we talk about how we're part of everything and we're connected to everything and it's all glorious and beautiful. But if that's true, then Hitler is part of us too.
Absolutely.
And once I realized that there's an aspect of Hitler inside me, inside all of us, that under the right pressures it could emerge even, then you have a lot more humility about it and compassion. And so I think that it's the same with this idea that I understand now how what happened in Germany could happen here.
Oh, absolutely. We grew up thinking, how did it happen? How did it happen? And what we've seen recently in the United States, we know how it happened. I think one of the people who's been of the greatest benefit to all of us over the last couple of years is Mary Trump. Because on one hand, she takes a stand for strong accountability and for not in any way underestimating the danger that phenomenon poses. But at the same time, with her explanation of so much of his own childhood experiences, has enabled us to have the compassion that we need to have as well. And holding that space, refusing to personally demonize, and at the same time, absolute conviction to hold accountable and to set proper boundaries. Just like you have to set boundaries individually, we have to set boundaries as a society.
Yeah, very much so. I totally think she has done great. And I also think we need to recognize that it's possible under different pressures, even for us to be twisted out of shape. I mean, maybe not for everybody, but it's possible. And so therefore we have to set up social structures that kind of encourage the best behavior. if to the extent that we can, and that's why for me, working with Rebecca Mercer, for example, to build these bridges. If we just cut off these bridges, we're not. If we blow up these bridges, where are we? We have to try to build these bridges where we can. But I think the challenge is going to be, how do we take people whose either lives are changing, their worlds are changing, are fading away. This idea of death rebirth that we've talked about. How do we help people see that if you give something up, you can be in a deeper reality, that you're not left with nothing? How do we help fundamentalists give away the literalness and to see that there's a deeper spirituality? And I don't know the answer to that, but that, I think, is our challenge.
Well, if you ever take ecstasy with Rebecca Mercer, please, I'll give you my email. Please let me know how it went. Okay, I'm going to ask you a few more rapid fire questions,
Okay.
if I may.
Yeah.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I would say that it was from Stan. It was that idea that the full expression of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. To open up to what's happening, rather than to run away from it, and that when you run away from it, it follows you. That just there's this ability to survive this opening up. You may survive in a different form, you may be changed, but that metamorphosis is essential, and that you're not going to be trapped. That what may seem like a trap, if you accept it, you will be free.
Is there anything that you would say you have no tolerance for?
No tolerance. I'm very much of a risk taker, and so I have a hard
That's obvious.
time when people hold on and don't want to take a risk when it's not working.
Especially given the world today, when people say, no, we can't do that. It's like, we got to try some new things here.
Yeah.
Well, I think that you are doing a great service to our society and to the world. I'm sure that this is a conversation that's happening in a lot of different places. I think it's very impressive. And also listening to you and getting to know you just a little bit that I was able to on the podcast, it is easy to feel great affection as well as respect for you. So thank you very, very much. And I know that I'm not the only one who will be eagerly watching and hoping that we continue to be on a path towards much greater openness and the end to the war on drugs. Thank you so much, Rick.
I say that the way I ended my TED Talk was just that humanity is in a race between consciousness and catastrophe.
We are.
And we need to help consciousness prevail, and psychedelics can help us, used well, but that it's not business as usual. It's a very dangerous time. And thank you for having me to share these ideas and talk with you.
You're so welcome. We as a species, like any species, our behavior is maladaptive for our survival, our collective behavioral patterns. And we will either evolve, mutate, or extinction is a very real possibility. So this is all part of a larger mutation experience and evolutionary leap, I think.
But I'm hopeful. I am hopeful.
Too.
And I see there are solutions if we can just get enough people to open up to them. But it's so scary. I mean, we came within 90,000 votes of having President Trump, Republican Senate and Republican House, and totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And, before you know it, New York Times would be out of existence, stuff like that. So, but somehow or other, we have this window of time. We don't know how long it's going to last, but we came right as close as you could get to danger and disaster. And so we have to use these next couple of years as best we can to try to really
I could not agree with you more. We didn't go over the cliff, but we're still just inches away. And it's not a time to take a nap. It's time for every kind of awakening possible, spiritually and politically. I agree with you entirely. Thank you, Rick. I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Marianne.
Bye-bye. So that was my interview with Rick Doblin. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Very serious conversation there. We need to become an enlightened species. We need to move the center of our emotional gravity from fear to love. Some people think that that's naive to think that we could do that it's naive to think that we could claim love as an organizing principle for human civilization. But what I think is naive is to think that we will last another 100 years on this planet if we don't at least try. So there are many different ways that people are opening up their hearts and minds to a much more expanded vision of what it means to be human, what our role is in the larger universe. Psychedelics, when used properly, can be one of those ways. And I think the work of Rick Doblin and people like him who are talking about the medical benefits, who are treating people such as veterans, their depression, their PTSD, and also the entire conversation around ways that we as humanity can recognize the evils of things like the war on drugs, like punishing things that do not need to be punished, and all the terrible havoc, tragic havoc that we have wreaked in so many people's lives because of things like the war on drugs. It's time for us to make different choices in our society. And I think the fact that we are making them is a very, very good sign. And now let's move to ask Marianne. I have a couple of questions I want to bring up that I think actually speak pretty deeply to things that we were talking about. One is from, I don't know if it's Sumer or Sumer, because it's only one M. But anyway, you know who you are. It says, hi, I was wondering, do you believe in the possibility of reincarnation? Well, I don't believe linear time is quite what we think it is. So I believe in different lifetimes, but I don't believe quite in past, present, and future the way we normally associate with past lives. I remember reading a book once where somebody said, "Why are you looking to your past lives for information? You should be looking to your future life for information." That sort of blew my mind. I think the closest I can come as a Course in Miracles student is to think of it as, yes, I believe in past lives, but I think they're all happening at once. I think that there are reincarnational realities, but we don't necessarily have to think of them in terms of you were then and now you are this. Okay, this next one is from Carmen. Marianne, with the recent media coverage on the murders and attacks on the elderly Asian communities and Asians in general in the United States, what do you feel the next steps would be on all sides to stop the root cause of this? And what do you think strategically would help in spreading empathy, understanding one another, and also share our stories and struggles as Asian immigrants and descendants of immigrants to educate in masses? Thank you. I really appreciate you and your team's time. Carmen, I appreciate you bringing this up. This is a problem. And not only is it a problem, it is one that has arisen frequently throughout our history. In 1882, we had the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which prohibited Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. When you talk about things like anti-Asian fervor, anti-Semitism, they go in and out, they hide. And then unfortunately, when the conditions are a certain way, they spring back up. And what we had with the Trump years was a legitimization of prejudice, a legitimization of bigotry, a legitimization of hate, actually. You know, it's not like we never had bigotry or we never had anti-Semitism or racism or Islamophobia or any of those things. Of course, they were here. When it comes to racism in the United States, unfortunately, it's never left. But all of these things have been part of the psychic bloodstream in the United States. But I grew up at a time when there was a social consensus we weren't supposed to be that way. There was a healthy shame around being that way. And that is what upsets me so much and concerns me so much about the times in which we live, is how unapologetic people are about their bigotry. One of the reasons I'm as aware as I am about the attacks on Asians, so much of the anti-Asian activity and fervor that is going on, is because of a young Asian woman who wrote some things on the internet that I read. And I thought, how good for her. She's doing what her ancestors would have her do. And I think that's very, very important. Whether you're Black, whether you're Jewish, whether you're gay, whether you're Asian, whether you're Muslim, you must stand up for your people. That's part of being an American, is we take a stand for the idea that all people, out of many, one. That is the whole first pillar of the United States. Out of many, one. That we are many ethnicities, that we are many cultural identities, that we are many religions, and that we are all living here. You know, a woman was talking to me in one of my classes. I can't remember. Let's see. One parent was Latino, and one was, I can't remember, but it was an exotic mix. But she said, I think it was Black. I can't remember. But she was talking about, I don't know who I am. And I said, you're American. That's what's so beautiful, that we're all here. And so when someone is anti-Mexican, anti-Black, anti-Jewish, anti-gay, anti-Asian, they're anti-American. What can we do about this? Like you said, what can we do on the causal level? That's what we've been talking about in this podcast today. How we need to expand our hearts to an openness. And this is beyond tolerance. Even James Madison said, tolerance still implies judgment. It's not enough to be tolerant. Tolerant, you're still judging. We will not be where we want to be until we all appreciate the brilliance in each other. My God, when you think of what the Chinese have contributed to the planet, and certainly what they've contributed to this country, and what they contribute now. And I think that's where a lot of the anti-Asian fervor is coming from. Jealousy, 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 jealousy. And so we must take a stand. We must do as you were doing by bringing it up. We must do as this young woman whose essay I was reading, making sure that people know what's happening. But also, I think these things are making all of us ask ourselves, my God, what has happened to us? And where there is love, there cannot be fear. Where there is unity, there cannot be separation. We need to claim what it really means to be an American. You know, one of the things that drives me really nuts about a lot of the Trumpist movement is that these people there call themselves patriots who stand on such open and unabashed hatred of the other. There's nothing patriotic about that. That's the most unpatriotic thing you could possibly do or be. I remember when the whole issue of marriage equality first came up. I mean, on television at the time, I remember I was on Larry King. I think I was the first straight heterosexual public person out there talking about how gay people should be able to get married. You know, everybody else, you know, all these political figures, well, I'm not there yet. Marriage is between a man and a woman. And then they would say they were in process, whatever they would say. And I remember somebody saying something like, thank you so much for standing up for gay people that you think we should be able to get married. And I said, I'm standing up for you because you're an American. Because life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And no matter who we are, what our sexuality, what our sex, the idea that anyone should have the opportunity here to spread their wings, anyone should have the opportunity to soar. That is the sacred first principle of our country. Today, you know, it's so much has been unleashed, not only race, in terms of race, in terms of Mexicans, in terms of Jews, in terms of Muslims, and now in terms of Asians. Immigrants, it's a terrible fever that America is going through. And each and every one of us must commit to being an antidote to this. We must include in our hearts those that we like and those that we do not like, including, and this is something that Rick was saying today, we must learn to love the bigot, learn to love even those who we do not like. Remember what Martin Luther King said? God said, I have to love my enemies. He didn't say I have to like them. So know that this is happening. Know that there is this anti-Asian activity that's going on out there, and take a stand. Take a stand however you can, not only in terms of that particular community, but also in terms in your own community, in the places where you inhabit, where you work, where you live, where you see signs of people separating from each other. Find those walls of separation within your own heart. Dissolve them as best you can. If each and every one of us become in our own way, in our own lives, in our own hearts, more loving, more embracing, more expanded in our capacity to love, then there will be this collective wave. And this collective wave will make us the human race we need to be. And it sure as heck will make us a better America. Thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it. If you have a question you want me to answer, please write to Marianne@castmedia.com. I want to thank Austin Kendrick and Amanda Elliott and Lawrence Selsky and all the great people at Cast Media. And thank you to you. And I hope that if you enjoy the podcast, that you'll rate it, you'll spread it around, and please take very good care of yourself and those around you. Much love to you. I'll see you next time. Hi, everybody. Marianne Williamson here. Welcome to my podcast. There's some new spirit in the air, something new rising, some big changes, and a lot of wonderful people talking about them. Join with me for conversations that matter.